Hi, the title of this session is Next Level Active Learning in Higher Education, Ways to Facilitate Exploration, Dialogue, and Success. I'm Marlene Graf. I'm a Professional Practice Associate Professor on the Logan campus. I teach in the Nutrition, Dietetics, and Food Sciences Department in the College of Agriculture and Applied Sciences. And I'm happy to be here. I've taught at USU for a long time. And so, welcome to this presentation. In September of 2019, there was a study conducted at Harvard University, and this is a published version. There's also a link to the source. It focused primarily on the response of students to different instructional approaches, specifically passive lecturing versus active learning. So the authors had done prior research on this topic, and they believe that students would learn more and perform better in active learning environments. They wanted to understand why so many students and faculty in higher education remain hesitant to embrace and or switch to higher level active learning methods. And so I was introduced to this research when I read a summary article in the Harvard Gazette. When I went back to the original source, I learned some great things, and I want to share them with you today. So the purpose of this session is to talk about why active learning is difficult, why it's hard to incorporate it into a classroom, and then how to better do that so that students and faculty members both benefit. Here's an outline. We'll just start with a description of active learning and talk about three primary ideas for improving implementation in your class, and then we'll end with some resources and additional ideas. So active learning is any teaching strategy that invites reflection, interaction, engagement, or experimentation. And this image just shows a handful of those going from simple activities to more complex. And one of the benefits of active learning is that it helps students learn at a deeper level and remember and retain more information. Also, students who have an active learning experience are able to perform better on higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And so there's lots of benefits of active learning. Here's a few that are listed here. Basically, deeper learning, better performance, higher grades. And yet, 1/3 of instructors, according to this study, who try active learning eventually revert back to passive lectures. Many cite that student complaints are a primary reason. Of course, there's other barriers to active learning, insufficient time or limited resources, or concerns about course evaluation scores, and also a perception that students prefer traditional methods over active learning strategies. And so the authors of this study note that novices in a subject, meaning students, are poor judges of their own competence. And if instructors explain and facilitate active learning, especially early on, and while it's happening during the semester, that student attitudes toward it can improve. So the first idea or recommendation is to discuss the data and your why for using active learning early on, and then come back to it as the semester progresses. So essentially, you start with a description of active learning, what specific active learning activities they can expect in your class, why you're implementing them, and then show evidence of effectiveness by discussing the data and specific studies. So, for example, I'll say, here's some active learning strategies that we're going to try this semester. Here's a description of each one and things to be ready for. And then we dive into the research and talk about statistics and results of the literature on active learning. And I say there's a strong correlation with improved performance and higher scores, but also better learning and understanding. And so I often talk about the Harvard study and the specific methodology. And essentially there were students in a physics course, and they were able to be in a classroom where there was passive learning, and they switched to an active learning classroom. And in both cases, they took exams measuring their understanding and what they had learned. And at the end, authors found that students felt as if they had learned more from the passive lectures, but they actually scored higher on the tests following active learning sessions. And so the conclusion was that active learning and feelings of learning were strongly anti-correlated. And so when I talk about this with students, I like to highlight a quote from one of the primary authors who says, "Deep learning is hard work, and the effort involved in active learning can be misinterpreted as a sign of poor learning. However, they're actually learning more than they think they are." On the other hand, a superstar lecturer can explain things in such a way that students feel like they understand more than they really do. And so then we talk about some other key messages in the study, and I try to normalize the fact that it's okay to feel like you're learning less or like this is hard, because there's increased cognitive effort required for active learning, and yet there's payoffs, and in the end the results are worth it, and students often warm up to the idea of active learning and are willing to give it a chance. So back to the 2019 Harvard study, the authors also expressed the same sentiment that the majority of students were more likely to engage in active learning and have a positive experience if they knew from the beginning and throughout the semester what the reason was behind it. So another thing I try to do is use quotes or language from past students to encourage current students and kind of give them a heads up on what to expect, and also help them see what the final results could be, or what some success stories are from former students. So idea number 2 is to flip your classroom, which just means designate some class time for homework time or time to work on things that you're learning, so that students have time to problem solve and work through stuff and get feedback. USU has a great website with resources for flipping the classroom that I hope you'll check out. It talks about ways to make it work in your discipline, in your classroom, and things to be aware of. Back to this study, the authors talk about how they shifted to a flip format where in the beginning of class they would divide students into small groups. They would give them a set of problems and allow students to solve those problems. While they were doing that, the instructor would be roaming around, observing what was happening, answering questions, noticing what they were struggling with and what they were understanding well. And then they would come together at the end. They would do a short targeted lecture that talked about specifically the problems that they had encountered, and they found that approach to be very effective. Another way to flip from a teacher-centered classroom to a more student-centered classroom is to try the Socratic method, sometimes called the fishbowl, where students get a chance to have deeper conversations and discussions and be observers and give feedback to each other. There's a TV series called The Parent Test on ABC that you can Google that demonstrates this strategy and how it works and kind of what to expect. I also like something called the gradual release of responsibility. It's a framework introduced by Fisher and Frey, where essentially you're going from a passive or traditional format to a more active or flipped format. And so in the beginning, you demonstrate to students what you would like them to do, and then there's some guided instruction where you're doing it as a class. And then from there, they do the same type of activity in smaller groups and then eventually on their own. And so here's an example of how I've done it. I like to use digital escape rooms, and there's a link to a presentation I've done on how they work. But basically, the first time we do digital escape rooms, we do it as a whole class, and we go through it together. And then later on, then they do it in small groups, and they can work with each other. And then eventually, they're able to do digital escape rooms on their own, and it's an easy step to know how to do it. So the third thing is to mix things up, and by this I mean mix in passive learning with active learning strategies, because the adding both of them helps enhance the learning experience. If you only do one or the other, then there's not the results aren't quite as good. And so I've given 2 presentations on this back in 2021. There's links to lessons I learned on a treadmill and also things we discovered about learning, things we discovered about teaching while we were students. And so I'd encourage you to refer to those because it talks about slides in this section. Beyond that, here are some books that I'd recommend for active learning strategies, and then some additional resources. If you'd like a copy of this PowerPoint with links, I'm happy to send it to you. Just send me an email, marlene.graf@usu.edu. Thanks for listening.